I have always been amazed by the Karnak temple complex in Luxor, located in Upper Egypt. It is the biggest temple complex ever created by human hands, covering more than 1.5 square miles. Just trying to picture a place that enormous is incredible. The main temple of Amun by itself spreads across about 62 acres. To put that into perspective, St. Peter's Basilica, one of the world's most famous churches, takes up only about 5.5 acres. That comparison really shows the unbelievable scale of Karnak. In this story, I'm going to take a closer look at how the ancient Egyptians managed to build this legendary temple and turn it into one of the greatest architectural achievements in history. When I first stood in front of the massive first pylon of the Temple of Amun, I could hardly believe what I was looking at. This enormous gateway stretches about 370 feet across and rises more than 142 feet into the air, making it the biggest temple pylon ever built. It was started during the rule of Nectanebo I, the founder of the last native dynasty of ancient Egypt, who governed the country in the middle of the 4th century before Christ. The builders used sandstone that came from Gebel el-Silsila, a quarry located roughly 100 miles south of Thebes. This stone was incredibly strong. It could span openings of more than 30 feet without breaking, which made it perfect for huge monuments like this one. Workers carved the blocks directly from cliffs beside the Nile River. By this time in Egyptian history, iron picks and chisels had replaced the bronze tools that craftsmen had relied on during the New Kingdom. Even so, the basic quarrying process had barely changed since the days when the pyramids were built. Groups of labourers who earned their pay in bread and vegetables instead of money surrounded each block with narrow trenches cut along 3 sides. After that, they carefully dug underneath until the stone finally separated from the bedrock. Once the block was freed, it was roughly shaped before leaving the quarry. The heavy stones were loaded onto large wooden sledges and dragged all the way to the Nile. From there, barges carried the cargo upstream until it reached Karnak. What surprised me most was the foundation. Even though the pylon was designed to be unbelievably massive, it rested on nothing more than a relatively shallow trench packed with layers of sand and gravel. Above that base, enormous sandstone blocks formed the outer shell of the structure. Like most Egyptian monuments, the stones fit together so precisely that almost no mortar was needed. The small amount that was used was simply a mixture of gypsum and sand. Its purpose was not to glue the blocks together, but to level each course so the next layer could be placed evenly. As the walls climbed higher and higher, workers built huge ramps around the growing monument so they could move the heavy stones into position. Part of one of those ancient ramps can still be seen beside the southern tower today. The ramps were usually supported by mud brick walls built at right angles to the pylon. The empty spaces between those walls were filled with packed mud, and in some places wooden beams were added to strengthen the structure. I also learned about a remarkable wall painting inside the tomb of Rekhmir, located across the Nile from Karnak. That painting gives a clear picture of how these ramps were made. It shows labourers drawing water into jars and mixing it with earth and chopped straw. The wet mixture was then carried in baskets to the brickmakers, who pressed it into moulds and left the bricks to dry in the sun. Once the bricks had hardened, they were stacked together to create the construction ramps that surrounded the monument. One detail I found especially interesting is that the first pylon was never actually finished. That is the reason its surface still looks rough today. If the project had been completed, skilled stoneworkers would have climbed to the top and gradually worked their way downward using chisels and stone pounders to smooth every exposed face. A good example of the final appearance can be seen at the Temple of Horus in Edfu. Built about 150 years later, its completed pylon gives me a pretty good idea of what Karnak's first pylon was originally meant to become. As I kept exploring the Temple of Amun at Karnak, one monument completely stole my attention. It was the towering obelisk built for Queen Hatshepsut. Long ago it stood beside an identical partner in the area that is now the courtyard between the 4th and 5th pylons. Even today, this incredible monument rises about 97 feet into the sky and weighs around 323 tons. That makes it the second largest ancient obelisk still standing anywhere in the world. Only the Lateran obelisk in Rome is larger. What amazed me even more was an inscription carved near its base claiming that both of Hatshepsut's obelisks were finished in only 7 months. To create monuments like these, the ancient Egyptians travelled to the granite quarries at Aswan, the most important source of granite in the country. Granite was so tough that ordinary copper and bronze chisels were almost useless against it. Sometimes workers built fires against the rock to heat it intensely before pouring water over the surface, hoping the sudden temperature change would create cracks. Even with that trick, shaping an obelisk still depended on an exhausting process. The workers relied on heavy pounding stones made of dolerite, an incredibly hard rock brought from the eastern desert. Each one weighed around 10 to 12 pounds. The men knelt shoulder to shoulder, each about an arm's length from the next, striking the granite again and again with steady, repeated blows. Modern experiments suggest that after a full day of this back-breaking work, they would have removed only about 1 inch of stone. One unfinished obelisk at Aswan shows just how difficult this kind of project could be. The enormous block still lies attached to the bedrock where the ancient workers left it. If they had completed it, the monument would have weighed close to 1,200 tons. Historians believe that roughly 130 labourers spent an entire year cutting deep trenches along both sides of the giant stone. They had even started carving underneath it to separate it from the quarry floor. Then they discovered serious cracks running through the granite. Because the damage made the monument unusable, all that hard work had to be abandoned. Hatshepsut's obelisk had a much happier outcome. Instead of giving up, the workers patiently continued striking the granite with their dolerite pounders until only a thin strip of stone connected the monument to the rock below. Once that narrow support remained, they used large wooden levers to break the obelisk free from the quarry. Getting such an enormous monument out of the quarry was another challenge altogether. The ancient Egyptians depended on huge wooden sledges whenever they had to move extremely heavy objects. One famous carving inside the tomb of a provincial governor named Jehuti Hotep shows 172 men pulling a 60-ton statue resting on an enormous sledge. Looking at the reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, I can see that Hatshepsut's obelisks were almost certainly transported the same way, with teams of workers dragging the massive stone monuments across the ground on giant wooden sledges. Once the obelisk had finally been lifted onto a huge wooden sledge, the workers secured it with thick ropes woven from palm fibres. From there, the long trip to the Nile could begin. If the path ahead was dampened with water to make the sled slide more easily and reduce friction, the job did not require as many men as I would have expected. Around 600 labourers, or roughly 1 worker for every half-ton of stone, would have been enough to pull the massive monument all the way to the river. The ancient Egyptians even used this same technique to transport the gigantic 1,000-ton statue at the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, a monument that weighed nearly 3 times as much as Hatshepsut's obelisks. The next stage of the journey was just as impressive. The carvings at Deir el-Bahari suggest that both of Hatshepsut's obelisks travelled together on the Nile aboard one enormous vessel. Instead of using separate barges, the Egyptians appear to have placed both monuments on a single giant craft while numerous smaller boats pulled it upstream. Considering the incredible weight of the cargo, that vessel was most likely not an ordinary boat. It was probably built as a massive raft made from large tree trunks fastened tightly together so it could support the enormous load. When the obelisk finally reached Karnak, getting it into its permanent position became another remarkable engineering challenge. One possible method is that the workers dragged the monument up a gigantic ramp made mostly of sand until it reached a point above its stone base. From there, they could have carefully lowered it toward the pedestal. Since 2 obelisks were being installed during the same project, the work may have been a little easier. While one monument was being raised, labourers could stand safely on the ramp built for the second obelisk and help guide the first one into place. There is also another theory that I find just as interesting. Instead of building an extremely high ramp, the Egyptians may have constructed a much lower one. In that case, one edge of the obelisk would have been fitted into a specially cut groove in the pedestal. Using large wooden levers, the workers could have lifted the monument a little at a time. As it slowly rose, they would have supported it with stacks of mud brick and heavy timbers to keep it from falling backward. Once the obelisk reached a steep enough angle, teams of men pulling on heavy ropes could have completed the final lift, bringing the giant stone into a perfectly upright position. Even though Hatshepsut's obelisk is an incredible sight, the part of Karnak that leaves the biggest impression on me is the enormous hypostyle hall. This breathtaking space covers about 58,000 square feet, which is well over 1 acre. It is best known for its 134 towering sandstone columns. The largest of them rise nearly 75 feet into the air and measure about 32 feet around. To understand just how gigantic they are, I like comparing them to the famous columns inside the Pantheon, which stand only about 39 feet tall. What surprised me most is that a building of this size was completed in a relatively short period of time. Most of the hall was constructed during the reign of Seti I. After his death, his son Rameses II finished carving and decorating the entire structure. The foundations beneath the columns were actually much simpler than I expected. Builders first spread a thin layer of sand across the ground. On top of that, they placed several courses of small rectangular stone blocks. Those modest foundations were strong enough to support the columns for thousands of years. However, during the late 19th century, the level of the Nile River rose and soaked the layers of soil beneath them. As the ground became saturated with water, 11 of the massive columns eventually collapsed. The method used to build the hall was just as fascinating as the finished structure itself. As each column grew taller, workers surrounded it with ramps made from mud brick. Little by little, those ramps expanded until nearly the entire hall was buried beneath tightly packed earth and piles of rubble. Once the fill reached the tops of the columns, the builders no longer needed cranes or complicated lifting machines. They simply moved the enormous sandstone roof slabs across the ramps and set them directly into place above the columns. After the roof had been completed, the workers slowly removed the ramps instead of tearing them down all at once. As the earth disappeared layer by layer, the sculptors took advantage of the remaining sections as temporary platforms. Working from the highest points first, they carefully smoothed the stone surfaces and carved the detailed decorations into each column before continuing downward until every part of the hall was finished. As I look back at everything that went into building Karnak, what impresses me most is the amount of time it took. This incredible temple complex was not created in a single generation. It was the result of many centuries of work. Even though thousands of years passed during its construction, the basic building methods stayed remarkably consistent. The craftsmen continued using the same mud brick ramps to lift enormous stones, the same reddish sandstone taken from nearby quarries, and they carried out their work beneath the same clear desert skies that stretched over ancient Egypt from one generation to the next. If you would like to explore Karnak in even greater detail, I invite you to watch my video on Scenic Routes to the Past, which is linked on the screen and in the video description. You can also find information there about my upcoming tours. In April, I will be visiting the Roman ruins of Spain. In May, I will be following the path of Alexander the Great. Then in November, I will be exploring Pompeii, Naples and Capri. There is plenty of new content available as well. I have uploaded a brand new Rome in Review video on the Told in Stone Patreon, released a fresh episode of the Told in Stone Footnotes podcast, and added new videos about the most famous historical sites in Greece on scenic routes to the past. If any of those topics interest you, I would love for you to take a look, and as always, I truly appreciate you spending your time with me. Thanks so much for watching.